The certified letter sitting on my kitchen counter looked official enough to make my stomach drop, but it was the embossed seal from the Lakeside Pines Homeowners Association that really got my blood pressure rising. I'm Zachary Coleman, and I'd inherited my grandfather's lake house in Crystal Lake, Minnesota, about 8 months ago. The place was a sanctuary, a beautiful 2-story cabin right on the water that had been in my family since 1967. What I didn't know when I moved in was that the HOA had been eyeing this property for years. I tore open the envelope and started reading. The words, "Notice of Eminent Domain Proceedings," jumped out at me like a slap across the face. My hands started shaking as I read further. According to this letter, signed by one Patricia Hendricks, HOA president, the association was claiming the right to seize my property for the construction of a community recreation center and marina facility. They were offering me $70,000 for a property worth at least $400,000 on the current market. This had to be some kind of joke. HOAs couldn't just use eminent domain. That was a government power reserved for actual public projects like roads, schools, or utilities. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I knew who could make sense of this legal insanity. "Zane Coleman's office," a familiar voice answered. "Hey, Sarah, it's Zach. Is my brother available?" "For you? Always. Hold on." A few seconds later, my older brother picked up. Zane was the district attorney for Hennepin County, a position he'd held for 3 years after working his way up from assistant DA. He was smart, thorough, and had a reputation for not tolerating corruption or legal shenanigans. "Little brother, what's going on? You sound stressed." "I just got a letter from my HOA claiming they're going to seize the lake house through eminent domain. Is that even legal?" There was a long pause on the other end. "Read me exactly what it says." I went through the entire letter, word for word. When I finished, Zane let out a low whistle. "That's not just illegal, Zach. That's potentially criminal. Private HOAs don't have eminent domain authority. Only governmental entities do. Someone is either incredibly stupid or incredibly bold. Send me photos of everything they sent you. I want to look into this." "You think they're trying to scam me?" "I think they're trying to intimidate you into selling at a fraction of what the property's worth. But if they're actually filing legal documents claiming eminent domain authority they don't have, that crosses into fraud territory. How long have they been on your case about this property?" I thought back to the past few months. Pretty much since I moved in. The HOA president, this woman named Patricia, she's been showing up with complaints every other week. My dock was 2 inches over some imaginary line. My boat was the wrong color. My outdoor lights were too bright. I figured she was just one of those power-hungry HOA types. She probably was scouting the property, trying to get you to want to leave. "Look, don't respond to this letter yet. Let me dig into what's actually going on. In the meantime, document everything, every interaction, every letter, every complaint. Get security cameras if you don't have them already." After hanging up with Zane, I spent the next hour installing a video doorbell and 2 outdoor cameras covering the driveway and waterfront side of the house. If Patricia wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had evidence of everything. That evening, as the sun was setting over Crystal Lake, I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. The video feed showed a sleek black Mercedes pulling up, and out stepped Patricia Hendricks herself. She was maybe 55, with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and the kind of pursed lip expression that suggested she'd been complaining about things her entire life. She wore a white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly salary as a freelance graphic designer. I opened the door before she could knock. "Patricia, what brings you by?" She looked surprised that I'd answered so quickly, but recovered with a tight smile. "Mr. Coleman, I wanted to follow up on the letter you received today. I'm sure you have questions." "I have questions, all right. Like, how exactly does a homeowners association think it can use eminent domain?" Patricia's smile didn't waver. "The Lakeside Pines HOA has special designation under Minnesota state law. We've been granted certain authorities to maintain and improve community standards and facilities. Your property, unfortunately, sits on the ideal location for a project that will benefit all 800 residents of this community. My grandfather built this house nearly 60 years ago. It was here before this HOA even existed. That may be true, but when you inherited the property, you inherited the deed restrictions and community covenants that now apply to it. The previous owner, your grandfather, was grandfathered in under old rules. You are not. I felt anger building in my chest, but I kept my voice level. So you're saying that because my grandfather died and left me his house, I somehow have fewer rights to it than he did? I'm saying the community has needs, Mr. Coleman. This isn't personal. We're offering fair compensation. $70,000 for a $400,000 property isn't fair compensation, Patricia. It's theft. Her smile finally cracked. The valuation was done by a certified appraiser. If you disagree, you're welcome to contest it through the proper channels. However, I should warn you that legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. Most people find it easier to simply accept the inevitable. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice. You have 30 days to respond to our offer. After that, we'll proceed with formal action. She turned on her expensive heels and walked back to her Mercedes. I watched her drive away, then immediately pulled out my phone to record a voice memo with every detail of the conversation while it was fresh. Zane had said to document everything, and I wasn't going to miss a single interaction. The next morning, I decided to do some research of my own. The local library in the town of Crystal Lake had archives of HOA documents, public filings, and property records. The librarian, a friendly woman in her 60s named Margaret, helped me pull up everything related to Lakeside Pines. You're the second person this month asking about these records, she mentioned as she set up the microfiche reader. Oh yeah? Who else was looking? Reporter from the Twin Cities said she was working on a story about HOA overreach. Nice young woman, left me her card. Margaret rummaged through a drawer and handed me a business card. Naomi Davis, investigative reporter, Minneapolis Star-Tribune. I pocketed the card and spent the next 3 hours going through documents. What I found was fascinating and disturbing. The Lakeside Pines HOA had been formed in 1995 when a developer bought up a bunch of farmland around Crystal Lake and built a planned community. My grandfather's property, along with about 20 other older homes, had been surrounded by this development. Over the years, the HOA had systematically purchased or forced out most of those original property owners through aggressive deed restrictions, fines, and legal pressure. Only 3 original properties remained. Mine was the largest and the only one with direct water access on the prime side of the lake. The other 2 were smaller cottages on the south end. I took photos of everything with my phone, paying special attention to a 2019 feasibility study that showed the HOA board discussing ways to acquire waterfront properties for development. When I got home, there was another Mercedes in my driveway, this time a white one. A man in an expensive suit was taking photographs of my house with a professional camera. I parked and got out. Can I help you? He lowered the camera. Mr. Coleman, I'm Richard Foster, the certified appraiser hired by the Lakeside Pines HOA. I'm conducting an exterior assessment of your property. Without my permission? The HOA covenants allow for property assessments when necessary for community business. I'm not entering your house or your yard, just photographing from public access points. The end of my driveway isn't a public access point. It's my private property. You need to leave. Richard's expression hardened. Mr. Coleman, I'm trying to do my job. If you obstruct this appraisal, it will be noted in my report and could affect your compensation offer. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm telling you that you're trespassing. You can photograph my house from the public road if you want, but you're not doing it from my driveway. He stared at me for a long moment, then walked back to his car without another word. As he backed out, I noticed Patricia's Mercedes pulling in from the other direction. She stopped in the road, and I saw her and Richard having an animated conversation through their car windows. Then both vehicles drove off. My phone rang. It was Zane. Zach, I've been looking into your HOA situation. You need to come to my office tomorrow. There's something you need to see. The next morning, I drove the 45 minutes to Minneapolis and made my way to the Hennepin County Attorney's office. Zane met me in the lobby and led me up to his office, a spacious room with a view of downtown and walls lined with law books. I had my staff pull everything we could find on Lakeside Pines HOA, Zane said, gesturing to a thick folder on his desk. This is worse than I thought. Your HOA president, Patricia Hendricks? She's done this before. He opened the folder and showed me a series of documents. In 2018, She was on the board of a different HOA in Edina. They pulled something similar, trying to pressure an elderly couple into selling their home for a fraction of its value by claiming the property was needed for stormwater management infrastructure. The couple fought it, and eventually, the whole scheme collapsed when it came out that Patricia and two other board members had formed a private LLC to buy the property and flip it for profit. So she's running the same scam here? That's what I'm trying to figure out. I pulled corporate filings for the past 2 years. 3 months ago, an LLC called Lakeshore Development Partners was registered in Minnesota. Want to guess who the principals are? Zane slid another document across the desk. I scanned the names: Patricia Hendricks, Richard Foster, and a third name I didn't recognize, Bradley Morrison. Who's Bradley Morrison? That's the interesting part. He's a commercial real estate developer based in Bloomington. He specializes in luxury resort properties. And according to public records, Lakeshore Development Partners has been in talks with a national hotel chain about building a boutique hotel and marina on Crystal Lake. The pieces clicked together in my mind. They're not building a community recreation center. No, they're not. They're trying to use the HOA's authority to seize your property cheaply, then sell or develop it for massive profit. The whole eminent domain claim is completely fraudulent. HOAs don't have that power, and even if they did, they can't use it for private commercial development. So what do we do? Zane leaned back in his chair. Here's where it gets complicated. I'm the DA, which means I prosecute criminal cases. What Patricia and her friends are doing is almost certainly fraud, possibly extortion, depending on how far they push this. But right now, they haven't technically committed a prosecutable crime yet. They've just sent you a threatening letter and hired an appraiser. So I have to wait for them to actually try to steal my house before you can do anything? Not exactly. I can't prosecute yet, but I can investigate. And more importantly, I can make sure they know they're being watched. In the meantime, you need to fight this through civil channels. Don't respond to their letter yourself. Hire a real estate attorney. I can recommend someone good. He wrote down a name and number. Victoria Langley, attorney at law. She's tough and she specializes in property rights cases. Tell her I sent you. I left Zane's office feeling slightly better. At least I wasn't alone in this fight. I called Victoria Langley from my car and managed to get an appointment for later that afternoon. Victoria's office was in a converted Victorian house in St. Paul, all hardwood floors and period details. She was maybe 40, with auburn hair pulled back in a professional ponytail and sharp green eyes that seemed to assess me the moment I walked in. After I explained the situation and showed her all the documents, she sat back and shook her head. I've seen some bold HOA overreach in my career, but this takes the cake. They're not even trying to hide what they're doing. Can they actually force me out? Not through eminent domain, no. But they can make your life miserable through other means: constant fines, liens on your property, legal harassment. The strategy is usually to make staying so unpleasant and expensive that people give up and sell. We need to get ahead of this. Victoria pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. First, we're going to send a formal response to their letter, making it crystal clear that their eminent domain claim is without merit and that any attempt to proceed will be met with legal action. Second, we're going to request all HOA records related to this supposed community project. They're required to make those available to members. Third, we're going to look into getting an injunction if they try to move forward. How much is this going to cost me? I'm not going to lie, Zach. Legal battles are expensive, but your brother mentioned you might have a fraud case here. If we can prove that, we can potentially get your fees covered and maybe even damages. Let me do some digging. I'll have a formal response to the HOA drafted by tomorrow. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. Victoria sent her letter, and the HOA responded by filing a formal complaint claiming I was violating multiple community covenants. Apparently my grass was a 1/4 inch too long, my mailbox was the wrong shade of black, and my boat dock needed to be repainted. The fines started rolling in. $50 for the grass, $100 for the mailbox, $200 for the dock. Each violation came with a formal citation and a deadline to remedy it. I mowed my lawn. I repainted my mailbox with the exact shade specified in the HOA handbook, which I had to special order for $30 a quart. I had my dock repainted for $800. The next week, I got 3 more citations. My house numbers were allegedly too small. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 12 hours after pickup. My outdoor furniture was not an approved material. It was harassment, plain and simple. But every citation was technically within the HOA's documented rules, even if those rules were absurdly petty and had never been enforced against anyone else in the community. I called Zane. "They're burying me in violations. I'm spending hundreds of dollars a week fixing things that don't need fixing." "Don't pay the fines," he said. "Fix legitimate issues if you want to, but don't pay their penalty fees. They'll try to put a lien on your property if the fines get high enough, but Victoria can fight that. More importantly, you're building a harassment case. Document everything. Take photos showing that other properties have the same supposed violations that they're citing you for." I spent an entire Saturday driving through Lakeside Pines with my camera, photographing mailboxes, trash cans, lawn furniture, and grass that was definitely longer than mine had been. The selective enforcement was obvious and damning. Meanwhile, Zane had assigned an investigator from his office to look into Lakeshore Development Partners. The investigator, a sharp guy named Marcus Chen, discovered that the LLC had already secured preliminary financing for a hotel project contingent on acquiring waterfront property. "They've got $12 million lined up from a private equity firm," Marcus told me when he stopped by my house to show me his findings. "The whole deal depends on getting your land. Without direct water access on this side of the lake, their project doesn't work. The other available waterfront is all shallow and swampy." "So if I don't sell, their whole scheme falls apart?" "Exactly, which means they're going to keep turning up the pressure." He wasn't wrong. 2 days later, Patricia showed up at my door with a sheriff's deputy. My stomach dropped when I saw the police car, but I opened the door calmly. "Mr. Coleman," Patricia said with false sweetness, "we have a noise complaint from your neighbors. Deputy Wilson here needs to discuss it with you." The deputy, a middle-aged guy who looked uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Sir, we received a complaint about excessive noise from your property last night around 10 p.m., loud music and shouting. I was home alone watching television last night at a completely normal volume. I was in bed by 9:30. Do you have anyone who can verify that?" "I live alone, but I can show you my security camera footage if you want. It's time-stamped and has audio." Patricia's expression flickered for just a moment. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly. The deputy looked at her, then back at me. "Actually, sir, if you've got footage, I'd like to see it. This way we can clear this up right now." I pulled up the footage on my tablet and showed him. The video clearly showed me coming home at 6 p.m., no other cars or people arriving, and no sound except crickets and the occasional owl. The deputy watched for a few minutes, then nodded. "Looks like a false complaint, madam," he said to Patricia. "Mr. Coleman, I apologize for the intrusion. Madam, I need to remind you that filing false police reports is a crime." Patricia's face went red. "I didn't file it directly. I'm just conveying concerns from community members." "Who specifically made the complaint?" the deputy asked. "I'll have to check my records." "Please do that and call the station with the name. We'll need to follow up." He tipped his hat to me and left. After they were gone, I called Zane immediately. "They just tried to get me in trouble with a false police report." "That's criminal," Zane said, his voice tight. "Did you get the deputy's name?" "Wilson, badge number 447. "I'll reach out to the sheriff's department." "That crosses a line, Zach. We might have enough to start a formal investigation now." Things went quiet for almost a week after that. No new citations, no visits from Patricia. I actually started to hope that maybe they were backing off. Then Victoria called me. "Zach, the HOA just filed a lawsuit against you. They're claiming you owe over $15,000 in fines, and they're seeking to foreclose on your property." $15,000? How's that possible? "They've been adding daily late fees and legal costs to every citation they issued. It's all technically in the covenant documents you agreed to when you inherited the property, but it's an absolute abuse of that authority. We're going to fight this, but I need you to understand this is going to get messy before it gets better." The lawsuit hit the local news 2 days later. The reporter who'd been researching HOA overreach, Naomi Davis, had gotten wind of it and called me for an interview. "Mr. Coleman, I've been investigating Lakeside Pines HOA for a story I'm working on. Your case fits a pattern I've been documenting. Would you be willing to talk to me on the record? I met Naomi at a coffee shop in town. She was in her early 30s, with dark curly hair and an intense focus that reminded me of Zane when he was working on a case. I've been tracking HOA abuses across Minnesota for the past year, she explained as she set up her recorder. Lakeside Pines keeps coming up. They've forced out 8 property owners in the past 5 years through aggressive fines and legal action. Your case is the most extreme I've seen, though. Why haven't you published anything yet? I'm building a comprehensive case. I want to show the systemic nature of what they're doing. But your situation, with the false eminent domain claim and the commercial development angle, that's the kind of specific evidence I've been looking for. If you're willing to let me tell your story, it could put real pressure on them to back off. I thought about it for a moment. My brother is the DA. Is that going to be a problem? Naomi's eyes lit up. Your brother is Zane Coleman? That's perfect. It shows that even people with legal connections aren't safe from this kind of abuse. Look, I'm not going to sensationalize this or make you look bad. I want to expose what's really happening with these HOA boards that think they're above the law. Okay, let's do it. The interview took 2 hours. Naomi was thorough, asking about every detail, every document, every interaction. She took copies of everything, including the fake eminent domain letter, the harassment citations, and the evidence Zane's investigator had found about Lakeshore Development Partners. This is going to be big, she said as we wrapped up. Give me a week to do some final fact-checking and get comments from the HOA. The story should run next Sunday in the main section. When I got home, there was a black Escalade parked in my driveway. A man in an expensive suit was waiting on my porch. He was tall, maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of confident posture that came from years of getting what he wanted. "Zachary Coleman," he said, extending his hand. "Bradley Morrison, I think we need to talk." I didn't shake his hand. "You're the developer trying to steal my property." "I'm the businessman offering you a fair deal. May I come inside?" "No, say whatever you came to say from right there." Bradley's smile didn't falter. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm prepared to offer you $300,000 for your property. That's more than 4 times what the HOA offered. Take it, walk away, and everyone's happy. My property is worth $400,000 minimum, and it's not for sale at any price. Mr. Coleman, let me be frank with you. I have $12 million riding on this project. I have investors, contracts, commitments. This deal is happening whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you walk away with money in your pocket or whether you lose everything fighting a battle you can't win. Is that a threat? It's business. I've built 27 successful projects in my career. I know how to handle obstacles. You can be smart about this or you can be stubborn. Your choice. Get off my property." Bradley finally dropped the smile. "You're going to regret this." I tried to be reasonable. He walked back to his Escalade and drove off. I immediately called Zane and Victoria on a 3-way call and recounted the conversation. That's witness intimidation," Zane said. "Or damn close to it. Marcus is already building a case file. Let me see if I can get a judge to approve some subpoenas. I want to see every communication between Morrison, Patricia, and this Richard Foster guy. There's conspiracy here. I can feel it," Victoria added. "On my end, I'm filing a motion to dismiss the HOA's lawsuit and seeking sanctions against them for harassment. We're also going to file a countersuit for abusive process and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Time to go on offense." The next few days were tense. I barely slept, jumping at every sound. I kept the security cameras running 24/7 and reviewed the footage every morning. Then, Naomi's article came out. The headline in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune read, "HOA Corruption, How Lakeside Pines Board Used Fake Eminent Domain Claim to Try to Seize Property for Private Development." The article was devastating. Naomi had done her homework, documenting not just my case, but the pattern of forced sales over the previous 5 years. She'd interviewed 3 other former property owners who'd been pressured into selling, including an 82-year-old widow who'd given up her home after being buried in citations and fines. The article included copies of the fake eminent domain letter, the corporate filings for Lakeshore Development Partners, and on the record, quotes from Morrison about the hotel project. Most damning, Naomi had discovered that Patricia Hendricks owned shares in Morrison's company through a shell corporation. The conflict of interest was staggering and completely undisclosed to HOA members. My phone started ringing off the hook. Other Lakeside Pines residents called to express support. Local TV stations wanted interviews. The state attorney general's office reached out to Zane. Everything exploded. Within 48 hours, an emergency HOA board meeting was called. According to the bylaws, any member could attend, so I showed up with Victoria. The community center was packed with angry residents. Patricia sat at the front table with the other 4 board members, all of them looking shell-shocked. Several people were shouting questions before the meeting even officially started. Patricia banged a gavel. "This meeting will come to order. We're here to address recent allegations in the media." "You mean the allegations that you've been running a criminal scam?" someone yelled from the back. "Those allegations are false and defamatory. Our legal counsel advises—" "Your legal counsel is part of the scam," another resident shouted. Victoria stood up. "Madam President, I'm Victoria Langley, representing Zachary Coleman. I have a list of questions for this board, and I believe the members deserve answers. First, why was Mr. Coleman never informed that you, personally, have a financial stake in Lakeshore Development Partners?" The room went silent. Patricia's face turned pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." Victoria pulled out documents. "I have corporate records showing that you own 23% of Lakeshore Development Partners through an LLC called Hendricks Holdings. You also failed to disclose this relationship when the board voted to pursue acquisition of my client's property. That's a clear conflict of interest and a breach of your fiduciary duty to this HOA." Chaos erupted. People were yelling, some demanding Patricia's resignation, others calling for criminal charges. Patricia tried to restore order, but it was useless. Within minutes, 3 of the other board members stood up and publicly resigned, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. That's when Zane walked in, along with 2 state investigators and Marcus Chen. "Patricia Hendricks," Zane said in his official DA voice, "we need you to come with us for questioning regarding allegations of fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and filing false documents." Patricia looked like she might faint. "I want my lawyer." "That's your right. You're not under arrest at this moment, but we strongly encourage you to cooperate with our investigation." Zane's appearance at the HOA meeting was tactical. By doing it publicly, he was making it clear this was an official investigation, not personal. Patricia, looking defeated, gathered her things and left with the investigators. The meeting dissolved after that. Residents clustered in groups discussing what they'd just witnessed. Several came up to me to apologize for not speaking up sooner or for not believing the HOA could be so corrupt. One older man shook my hand firmly. "I'm George Fletcher. I live 3 streets over. I'm also a retired attorney. I'd like to help organize a reform slate for the board if you're interested. We need to clean house completely." Over the next week, Zane's investigation moved quickly. With Patricia's financial records subpoenaed, the whole scheme became clear. She'd been systematically targeting properties with development potential, using her position as HOA president to drive down their values through harassment, then either buying them herself through shell companies or facilitating sales to Morrison's company at below-market prices. The profits were substantial, probably close to $2 million over 5 years. Richard Foster, the appraiser, had been providing deliberately low valuations in exchange for cash payments. The whole operation was sophisticated and had been running for years. Morrison tried to distance himself, claiming he'd simply been buying properties on the open market and had no knowledge of Patricia's tactics. But email records told a different story. Messages between Morrison and Patricia discussed specific properties to target and strategies for forcing sales. 3 weeks after the HOA meeting, formal charges were filed. Patricia Hendricks was charged with fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and filing false documents. Richard Foster faced similar charges. Bradley Morrison was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and bribery. The arrest made headlines across Minnesota. The image of Patricia being led out of her expensive home in handcuffs was on every local news station. The reporter, Naomi Davis, did a follow-up piece that won state journalism awards. For me, the immediate crisis was over. but there was still cleanup. Victoria filed motions to dismiss all the citations and fines against me. With Patricia gone and the board in disarray, the HOA's attorney withdrew from the case, and the lawsuit was dropped entirely. A new board was elected, with George Fletcher as president. One of their first acts was to pass a resolution apologizing to me and the other property owners who'd been targeted. They also voted to refund all the money I'd spent complying with harassment citations, about $3,000 total. The criminal cases moved through the courts over the following months. Patricia took a plea deal rather than face trial. She pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges and was sentenced to 3 years in prison plus restitution to the victims. Her assets were seized to pay back the money she'd stolen. Richard Foster also took a plea deal, getting 18 months in prison and losing his appraiser's license permanently. Bradley Morrison fought his charges but was ultimately convicted at trial. The jury didn't buy his claims of innocence, not with emails showing he'd directly instructed Patricia on which properties to target. He got 5 years in federal prison and his company collapsed. Through all of this, I just wanted to get back to normal life. The lake house that had been my sanctuary had become the center of a legal storm, but slowly, peace returned. One evening in late fall, almost a year after the first eminent domain letter arrived, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset over Crystal Lake. Zane came by with a 6-pack of beer and joined me. "Hell of a year," he said, handing me a bottle. "You're telling me. Think it's really over?" "The criminal cases are done. Patricia and Morrison are in prison where they belong. The HOA has been completely reformed. Yeah, little brother, I think it's over." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water ripple in the evening breeze. "Thanks for having my back on this," I said. "I don't think I could have fought this without you." "That's what family does. Plus, it felt good to take down some genuinely bad people. You don't get that satisfaction in every case." He paused. "You going to keep the house?" "Absolutely. Grandpa would have wanted me to fight for it, and now that all this craziness is behind me, I can actually enjoy it again." The new HOA board had been reasonable and responsive. They'd scaled back a lot of the ridiculous rules that Patricia had implemented, and they'd started treating homeowners like valued members of a community rather than subjects to control. Naomi's reporting led to state legislation reforming HOA oversight in Minnesota. New laws required stricter financial disclosure from board members, limited the fines HOAs could impose, and created an ombudsman office for homeowners to report abuse. Victoria Langley became something of a local celebrity in property rights circles. She started getting calls from people across the region dealing with HOA problems, and her practice grew substantially. As for me, I went back to my graphic design work and started actually enjoying the lake house the way it was meant to be enjoyed. I bought a new boat, had friends over for weekend parties, and spent summer evenings fishing off the dock. The whole experience taught me that standing up to bullies matters, even when they hide behind official-sounding titles and legal documents. Patricia and her cronies had counted on people being too intimidated or too worn down to fight back. Most of their previous victims had given up, not because the HOA was right, but because the fight seemed too hard. I'd gotten lucky having Zane as my brother and finding Victoria as an attorney. Not everyone had those resources. That's why the legislative reforms were so important. People needed protection from the kind of abuse that Patricia had systematized. One afternoon, about 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Zachary Coleman?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's calling?" "My name is Helen Brennan. I'm dealing with some trouble with my HOA in Rochester, and Victoria Langley suggested I call you. She said you might be willing to share your story and give me some advice." I spent an hour on the phone with Helen, walking her through what I'd experienced and what had worked in fighting back. I gave her Victoria's contact information and some tips on documentation and evidence gathering. After we hung up, I realized that Patricia's attempt to steal my house had turned into something bigger than just my personal fight. It had exposed a systemic problem and led to real change. Other people were now being helped because I'd refused to back down. That felt good in a way I hadn't expected. George Fletcher, the retired attorney who'd taken over as HOA president, stopped by one evening to drop off some updated community documents for my signature. "How's the new board working out?" I asked, offering him a beer. Much better than the old regime," he laughed. "We're actually focusing on real issues like maintaining common areas and organizing community events, not playing petty power games. Who knew an HOA could actually be useful?" Revolutionary concept. Speaking of which, we're having a community barbecue next month. I hope you'll come. A lot of residents still feel bad about how you were treated, and they'd like a chance to meet you properly. You know, without the drama. I'd like that. It would be nice to actually get to know my neighbors under normal circumstances. The barbecue turned out to be a great day. The weather was perfect, the food was good, and people were genuinely friendly. Several residents came up to thank me for exposing the corruption that had been festering in the HOA. Others shared their own stories of dealing with Patricia's harassment over the years. I met a couple named Tom and Linda Morrison, no relation to Bradley, who lived a few streets over. They'd been considering moving because of the hostile HOA environment, but decided to stay after the reforms. "You saved this community," Linda told me. "We'd talked about selling and getting out, but we love it here. We just couldn't stand Patricia and her cronies anymore." "I didn't do it alone. It took a lot of people stepping up." "Maybe, but you were the one who stood your ground when it mattered most. That took guts." As the sun started setting and people began packing up, George called everyone together for an announcement. "Before we wrap up tonight, I want to present something on behalf of the new board." He held up a small plaque. "Zachary Coleman, in recognition of your courage in standing up to corruption and helping reform our community, we'd like to name the new dock extension after your grandfather, Walter Coleman, whose property exemplified the original spirit of Crystal Lake." The crowd applauded. I was genuinely touched. The dock extension was a project the new board had approved to give more residents water access using legitimate HOA funds for an actual community improvement. "Thank you," I managed to say. My grandfather would have been proud. He always said this lake brought out the best in people. I'm glad we're getting back to that. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The criminal trials wrapped up, the civil lawsuits were resolved, the new HOA board proved competent and reasonable. I could finally relax and enjoy my home. Zane stopped by one Sunday morning with donuts and coffee. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing me a newspaper. Naomi Davis had written another piece, this time a year later follow-up on the Lakeside Pines scandal. The article detailed the reforms that had been implemented, the success of the new board, and the state legislation that had passed. At the end, there was a quote from me. "The biggest lesson I learned is that you can't let bullies win, even when they have official-sounding titles. HOAs are supposed to serve homeowners, not control them." "Good quote," Zane said. "Mom would have been proud of you." Our mother had passed away 3 years earlier, and she'd loved the lake house as much as Grandpa had. She would have been heartbroken to see what Patricia tried to do to it, and thrilled to see justice done. "Think Grandpa knew what he was getting me into when he left me this place?" I asked. Zane laughed. "Knowing Grandpa? Probably. He was always talking about standing up for what's right. Maybe this was his final lesson." Over the next few months, I watched as the Lakeside Pines community truly transformed. The new board implemented transparent budgeting, regular community meetings where residents could voice concerns, and reasonable rules that actually made sense. The neighborhood felt friendlier, more relaxed. Property values actually increased once news spread that the corruption had been cleaned out. Several houses sold quickly to families looking for exactly the kind of community Lakeside Pines was becoming. I even started dating someone I met at one of the community events, a teacher named Rebecca who'd moved into the neighborhood right before the scandal broke. She'd watched the whole thing unfold with fascination and told me she'd been impressed by how I'd handled it. "Most people would have just given up or moved away," she said over dinner one night. "You actually fought back and made things better for everyone." "I was mostly just stubborn and lucky to have a brother who's the DA," I admitted. "Give yourself more credit. You stood up when it mattered." The 1-year anniversary of Patricia's arrest came and went. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran a retrospective piece that Naomi wrote, looking at how the case had changed HOA regulation across Minnesota and sparked similar reforms in other states. I was quoted again, "HOAs aren't inherently bad, but they need oversight and accountability like any other organization with power over people's homes and lives. What happened at Lakeside Pines could happen anywhere if residents don't stay vigilant. Several people reached out after the article, asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA problems. I couldn't help everyone, but I did what I could, connecting people with Victoria or other property rights attorneys and sharing resources about HOA reform. It felt good to turn my bad experience into something helpful for others. One crisp October morning, I was out on the lake in my boat when I saw George Fletcher on his dock waving me over. I pulled up and he helped tie off the boat. "Got some good news," he said with a grin. "The state HOA Ombudsman's office just released their first annual report. They've handled over 300 complaints in the past 6 months and helped resolve most of them without litigation. They specifically cited your case as the catalyst for the program." That's great. I mean, it's terrible that there are 300 complaints, but at least people have somewhere to turn now. Exactly. Oh, and I heard through the grapevine that Patricia was denied early parole. She'll serve her full sentence. I felt a grim satisfaction at that news. Patricia had destroyed lives and stolen from people she was supposed to represent. She deserved every day of that sentence. As fall turned to winter, I prepared the lake house for the cold months, winterizing the dock, storing the boat, making sure the heating system was in good shape. It was my second winter in the house, but it felt like the first one where I could truly relax and enjoy it without the constant threat hanging over my head. Christmas came, and I hosted Zane and his family at the lake house. His kids, my nephews David and Marcus, were 7 and 9, and they loved the snow-covered landscape and the frozen lake. We went ice fishing and built a snowman, and generally had the kind of peaceful family holiday that seemed impossible just a year earlier. "Uncle Zach, is this really the house that Bad Lady tried to steal?" Marcus asked over hot chocolate. "It is, buddy." "But your daddy stopped her, right?" David chimed in. "Your daddy and your uncle both stopped her," Zane's wife Christine corrected gently. "They worked together." "That's right," I agreed. "Sometimes it takes a team to stand up to bad guys." After the kids went to bed, Zane and I sat by the fireplace with whiskey. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just taken that first offer and moved?" he asked. "Sometimes my life would have been easier, that's for sure. But Patricia and Morrison would still be running their scam. Other people would have been hurt, and I'd have lost Grandpa's house, which would have gutted me. You did good, little brother. Not everyone has the backbone to fight the way you did. I had help. Good help. Without you, Victoria, Naomi, Marcus, all of you, I would have been crushed. Maybe. But you were the one who stood in the door and said no. That's where it started." Spring came early that year. By late March, the ice on Crystal Lake had melted and the community was coming back to life. The new HOA board organized a spring cleanup day, and dozens of residents turned out to clear winter debris from common areas and prepare for summer. It was the kind of community activity that an HOA should organize, bringing neighbors together for mutual benefit rather than using authority to tear people apart. I worked alongside Tom and Linda Morrison, raking leaves and trimming bushes around the community pavilion. George Fletcher supervised with good humor, making sure everyone stayed hydrated and had the tools they needed. "This is what it should have been all along," Tom said, echoing my thoughts. "People working together because they want to, not because they were afraid of being fined." By mid-April, the weather was warm enough for me to put the dock back in. Several neighbors came over to help, making quick work of what would have been an all-day job alone. Afterward, we grilled burgers and sat around talking as the sun set. These were the moments that made the fight worthwhile. This was the community that Patricia's greed had almost destroyed, now thriving and genuine. Naomi Davis called in early May with news that she'd won a regional journalism award for her coverage of the HOA scandal. She invited me to the award ceremony. "You're part of this story," she said. "I'd like you to be there." The ceremony was at a hotel in downtown Minneapolis. I felt out of place in a room full of journalists and media professionals, but Naomi made sure to introduce me to people and made me feel welcome. When she accepted her award, she gave a speech about the importance of local investigative journalism and holding powerful people accountable, even in seemingly mundane institutions like HOAs. The Coleman case showed me that corruption can exist anywhere, in any organization, and that ordinary people need advocates who will dig into these stories and expose the truth. I'm grateful to Zachary Coleman for trusting me with his story and for having the courage to fight back against an abusive system." The applause was genuine and warm. After the ceremony, several other journalists came up to ask about the case. One was working on a story about HOA reform legislation in Wisconsin. Another was investigating a similar scandal in Iowa. The ripple effects of standing up to Patricia just kept spreading. That summer was the best I'd had in years. I spent nearly every day on the lake, either working from my porch or out on the water. Rebecca and I grew closer, and by August, she was spending most weekends at the lake house. "Have you ever thought about running for the HOA board?" she asked one lazy Sunday afternoon. "God, no. I've had enough of HOA drama to last a lifetime." "But you'd be good at it. You understand what went wrong and how to fix it." "George and his team are doing a great job. I'm happy to support them, but I don't need an official position. I just want to enjoy my house and my life." "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, I think people would support you." In September, the Lakeside Pines HOA held its annual meeting. For the first time in years, it was actually well attended and productive. George presented a transparent financial report showing where every dollar of HOA fees had been spent. The community voted on several proposals, including updating the playground equipment and improving security lighting in common areas. I stood up during the open comment period. "I just want to say thank you to George and this board for turning things around. A year ago, I was ready to hate this HOA forever. Today, I'm proud to be part of this community. That's because of leadership that actually cares about residents." The room applauded. Several other people stood to share similar sentiments. It was night and day from the chaotic emergency meeting where Patricia had been confronted. As we filed out of the community center, an elderly woman I'd never spoken to before approached me. "Mr. Coleman, I'm Dorothy Green. I wanted to thank you. My husband and I were one of the couples Patricia targeted years ago. We sold our house and moved because we couldn't take the harassment anymore. I've regretted it ever since. What you did, standing up to her, it means more than you know. It validates that we weren't crazy, that we were really being victimized." I didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry you went through that. I wish I'd been here sooner to help." "You did help. You stopped her from hurting anyone else. That matters." Later that night, I told Zane about the encounter. "That's the part of this job I love," he said, "when you can actually make a difference in people's lives, not just prosecute crimes, but prevent future ones. Patricia's in prison, Morrison's business is destroyed, and the laws have changed. That's a win all around." As fall arrived again, nearly 2 years since the fake eminent domain letter had started this whole saga, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed. My lake house was secure. The HOA was functioning properly. Patricia and her co-conspirators were paying for their crimes. New laws protected other homeowners from similar abuse. More than that, I'd found a community I actually wanted to be part of. Friendships had formed from the crisis. The neighborhood felt alive and welcoming in ways I'd never expected. One crisp October evening, I stood on my dock watching the autumn colors reflect in the lake's surface. Rebecca came out and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just grateful, I guess. Grateful this place is still mine. Grateful for everyone who helped fight for it. Grateful that something good came out of something that started so badly." "Your grandfather would be proud." "Yeah, he would." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the distance I could hear neighbors laughing at an outdoor gathering. The sound carried across the water, a reminder that this was what community was supposed to be. Patricia Hendricks had tried to turn a homeowners association into a personal piggy bank, using fear and legal intimidation to steal from the people she was supposed to serve. She'd almost succeeded. But in the end, the truth came out, justice prevailed, and the community became stronger for it. As for me, I was exactly where I wanted to be, in the house my grandfather built, surrounded by genuine neighbors, living the peaceful lake life I'd inherited and fought to keep. The battle was over. The good guys had won, and the lake house was home.